In the summer of 1981, the most dangerous cartel operative in Miami didn't carry a weapon. She carried a locked suitcase. She was 5 feet tall, fluent in 5 languages, educated at the Sorbonne in Paris, and she had converted to Judaism while living in Israel. Her associates in the Colombian underworld called her the Hummingbird, a name that captured everything about her. The size, the speed, the way she could hover in places where nothing her size should survive. On an August afternoon, she walked into a suburban office in Miami Lakes carrying a suitcase so heavy she needed both hands to move it. Inside was $484,000 in small, dirty bills, street cash from the cocaine trade. She set it on the floor, negotiated a commission rate down to 5.5% with the calm precision of someone refinancing a mortgage, and walked out. The entire exchange took less than an hour. The office she walked into was a fake. The investment firm was a front. The man she trusted most in the operation was wearing a wire, and every dollar she delivered was being logged as evidence by the Drug Enforcement Administration. But she didn't know any of that. Not yet. And by the time she figured it out, over 300 of her most intimate conversations had been recorded. Her boss had been indicted, and the financial architecture she'd spent years building had been dismantled down to the last wire transfer. Her name was Marlene Navarro, and the story of how she rose, how she ruled, and how she fell is not a story about cocaine. It's a story about what happens when the smartest person in the room has no one to talk to, until someone finally listens. The standard biography of a 1980s drug trafficker begins in poverty, a slum in Medellin, a dirt road outside Bogota, a childhood defined by scarcity and the understanding that legitimate paths led nowhere. Marlene Navarro's biography begins at the Sorbonne. She was Colombian by birth, but her formative years played out across a geography that had nothing to do with the drug trade. She studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, not a semester abroad but a real academic tenure at one of the oldest, most prestigious universities in Europe. That education gave her more than knowledge. It gave her a framework, a way of seeing herself as someone who operated at the highest level of any room she entered. It was a self-image she would carry for the rest of her life, long after the room she entered started smelling like stacked cash and fear. After Paris, she moved to Israel. She converted to Judaism, a decision that marked her as someone willing to shed identities entirely and build new ones from scratch. By her 30s, she spoke 5 languages fluently, moved effortlessly between cultures, and possessed a social fluency that most diplomats would envy. People who met her described a woman who was simultaneously magnetic and unsettling, charming and warm one moment, ice cold and precise the next. She didn't enter a room. She changed its temperature. The question that defined her origin wasn't where she came from. It was why she entered the drug trade at all. She didn't need to. She wasn't fleeing poverty or running from violence. The answer lies in a specific collision of timing, talent, and temperament. By the late 1970s, the Colombian cocaine cartels had a problem that no amount of violence could solve. They were generating physical cash faster than they could move it. Mountains of small bills, 5s, 10s, 20s, piling up in stash houses, buried in the Everglades, stuffed into the walls of Miami apartments. The cartels didn't need more enforcers. They needed bankers. They needed someone who understood international wire transfers, offshore accounts, shell corporations, and the regulatory architecture of the global financial system. They needed someone who could walk into a bank in a designer suit and walk out with a receipt for a $500,000 wire to Panama, and nobody would think twice. Navarro was that person, not because she stumbled into the role, but because she recognized a market opportunity and decided she was the best candidate to fill it. The legitimate financial world had glass ceilings. The cartel world had none, just results and consequences. For a woman with her intellect, her languages, her European polish, and her appetite for risk, the calculation was straightforward. The cocaine trade didn't need her to touch a single gram of product. It needed her to touch every dollar the product generated. She didn't see it as crime. She saw it as logistics. She aligned herself with Carlos Jader Alvarez, a Bogotá-based drug lord whose organization controlled a cocaine distribution network stretching from Colombia through Miami and into California and Colorado. Alvarez was capable of extraordinary violence, but he was also a strategist, smart enough to recognize that his empire's greatest vulnerability wasn't law enforcement raids or rival cartels. It was the cash. Billions in revenue meant nothing if it couldn't be laundered, moved, and repatriated. He needed a financial architect, and in Navarro, he found one who operated on a level no one else in his organization could match. He appointed her as his chief North American agent, based in Miami. The title undersells what she actually was. She was building a shadow financial institution from scratch, one sophisticated enough to process tens of millions of dollars annually while leaving no traceable footprint. Her first and most important decision was structural. She built a firewall between the product and the money. The cocaine moved through one set of hands: regional managers, distributors, couriers. The cash moved through hers. She never touched the drugs. She never met the street-level dealers. She existed in a parallel universe of wire transfers, offshore accounts, and commission negotiations, connected to the violence only by the origin of the bills she laundered. Her network was meticulously compartmentalized. Oscar Garcia supervised domestic cocaine distribution. Ricardo Jader ran the California pipeline. Said Pavon Jader managed Denver. Carlos Alvarado oversaw the physical transportation of cleaned funds back to Colombia. Each layer answered to Navarro. None of them saw the full picture. Only she held the complete map. Her interface with the legitimate world was managed through a network of corrupted professionals. Attorneys like Lester Rogers and David Jaffe. Banking executives like Manuel Sanchez at the Bank of Miami. She negotiated with them the way a CFO negotiates with vendors. Coolly, precisely, always pushing for better terms. Her standard laundering commission was 5.5%. On the volumes she was moving, that rate represented millions in annual fees flowing to the people who helped her make dirty money clean. The physical mechanics of her operation were deceptively simple. Cash from regional distributors would be collected, counted, and delivered, often by Navarro herself, in locked high-end suitcases. No trash bags, no cardboard boxes. She maintained the aesthetic of a corporate courier, even when hauling $500,000 in street cash across a Miami parking lot. The suitcases were transferred to laundering contacts, converted into large denominations or certificates of deposit, then wired to offshore accounts in Panama and Switzerland. By the time the money reached Alvarez in Bogotá, it was untraceable. The moment she became truly indispensable came in October 1981. 3 of Carlos Jader Alvarez's young children were kidnapped in Bogotá by a radical left-wing guerrilla group. In the cartel world, the standard response was overwhelming retaliatory violence. Alvarez had the men and the weapons for that approach. But for the ransom itself, the rapid conversion and delivery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency cash, he didn't call his enforcers. He called Navarro. She flew to Bogotá to assess the crisis, then immediately returned to Miami to execute the financial logistics. On November 6th, she met her most trusted laundering contact in a suburban parking lot and handed him a bag containing $285,700 in small bills that needed to be converted to hundreds for the ransom payment. She handled it the way she handled everything, with precision, without panic, and without a wasted step. That moment cemented something. Alvarez didn't just trust her with his money, he trusted her with his children's lives. In the hierarchy of the cartel, there was no higher currency than that. By early 1982, Navarro was personally overseeing an estimated $80 million a year in illicit revenue. She was the central nervous system of a transnational financial operation, and she ran it with the autonomy of someone who had proven herself indispensable in every way that mattered. At the height of her power, Marlene Navarro's daily reality existed in a state of constant, almost surreal contradiction. She would spend a morning coordinating a $500,000 wire transfer to a numbered account in Panama, break for lunch at a restaurant where she charmed the staff in flawless English, then spend her afternoon collecting a locked suitcase full of cash from a parking lot in suburban Miami. Cash that smelled like the streets it came from. She maintained the discipline of a corporate executive throughout all of it. Her commission rates were negotiated to the decimal point. Her deliveries were scheduled, not improvised. Her network of attorneys and banking contacts operated on retainer, not on trust. In an industry where most participants eventually drowned in their own excess, the gold chains, the exotic cars, the nightclub tabs that could fund a small country, Navarro kept her consumption calibrated to her cover. She dressed impeccably. She appreciated fine things, Cibus porcelain sculptures, European art, the kind of objects that signaled taste rather than mere wealth. She could be coquettish and charming in one conversation, then shift to ice-cold authority in the next. Associates found this disorienting. That was exactly the point. The numbers from this period tell their own story. In a single delivery in late April 1982, she handed over $1 million in cash to the Dean International Office. One delivery, $1 million. And it was a routine transaction, one data point in a continuous stream that included a $547,000 wire in August, a $679,000 collection in Denver, and a $735,000 handoff later that same month. These weren't exceptional events. They were Tuesday. Her control over the operation was absolute. She didn't share decision-making authority with anyone in North America. She reported directly to Alvarez, and Alvarez gave her the latitude to run the financial wing as she saw fit. Regional distributors answered to her. Attorneys served at her pleasure. Banking contacts existed because she allowed them to exist. In the brutally hierarchical world of the Colombian cartels, a woman holding that level of autonomous power was virtually unprecedented. But power without peers produces a specific kind of blindness. She was surrounded by people who feared her, needed her, or worked for her, but none of them were her equals. The enforcers were violent and uneducated. The bankers were greedy, but intellectually ordinary. The attorneys understood law, but not the geopolitical chessboard she operated on. She was a woman who had studied at the Sorbonne, debated philosophy, navigated the cultural complexities of 3 continents. Now she spent her days counting street cash in parking lots and explaining basic financial concepts to men who could barely read a balance sheet. The cognitive dissonance was enormous, and she managed it the only way she could, by insisting to herself and everyone around her that what she did was fundamentally different from what the men with guns did. The off-ramp was always there. She had accumulated enough wealth and enough international infrastructure to disappear. She could have dissolved her Miami operation, retired to Europe or Israel, and lived comfortably and anonymously for the rest of her life. She had the languages, the cultural knowledge, and the financial resources to vanish completely. She stayed, not because she needed the money, because she needed the game. The intellectual challenge of moving $80 million a year through a financial system designed to stop exactly that. The thrill of being the best at something no one else could do was more addictive than anything her organization sold on the streets. She couldn't walk away from the board while she was winning. And then Roberto Darius walked through the door. He was 46 years old, Cuban-born, and carried himself like a man from a different era. Soft-spoken, gentlemanly, impeccably polite. He had fought at the Bay of Pigs and spent 20 months in Castro's prisons afterward. He'd come to America, tried to build a legitimate life in Florida real estate, failed, done time for tax fraud, and emerged owing the IRS $200,000 with no way to pay it. Out of pure financial desperation, he'd volunteered to work as an informant for the DEA. His name was Roberto Darius, and he was the most important person Marlene Navarro would ever meet, though not for the reasons she believed. Darius entered Navarro's orbit through Lionel Paytubi, a disgraced former bank vice president who had been fired for laundering drug money and was now freelancing as a broker in Miami's shadow financial market. In July 1981, Paytubi told the agents running a fake investment firm called Dean International that he had a client who needed to exchange $1 million a week. That client was Navarro. When she met Darius for the first time, she didn't see an informant. She saw something far more dangerous to her than any law enforcement officer could ever be. She saw an equal. Darius didn't fit any of the profiles her internal radar was calibrated to detect. He wasn't a rough-edged DEA agent trying to fake street credibility. He wasn't a cartel rival probing for weakness. He was cultured, educated, well-mannered, and fluent in the unspoken codes of elite Latin American society. He treated her with respect, not the performative deference of a subordinate, but the genuine courtesy of a peer. He listened when she talked. He understood the references she made. He engaged her mind. For a woman who had spent years surrounded by people who feared her but couldn't match her intellectually, this was irresistible. And it was exactly what the DEA was counting on. Though in truth, Darius's warmth wasn't manufactured. It was who he actually was, which is what made the deception perfect. The most effective lies are the ones built on something real. The speed of Navarro's trust was staggering by any standard and fatal by the standards of the cocaine trade. On August 5, 1981, barely weeks into their relationship, she told Darius that she personally handled $80 million a year for her boss. She detailed the geographic flow of the money, the organizational structure, the scale of the operation. She handed him the blueprint to dismantle the entire Alvarez network. And she did it voluntarily because she wanted to impress him. That single conversation gave the federal government the organizational roadmap and the legal predicate they needed. Everything that followed was confirmation. She began visiting Darius almost daily. She brought him into money exchanges, invited him to witness cash deliveries, discussed the origins and destinations of funds that no outsider should have known about. When the Alvarez children were kidnapped, she didn't just handle the ransom logistics. She told Darius about them, folding him into the most sensitive crisis the organization had ever faced. She referred to her vast network of distributors, with clinical detachment, as the powder people. She mentioned her boss's operations in the Colombian jungle. She gave him everything, not because he asked for it, but because she needed someone to give it to. Nobody warned her. Nobody could. She operated at an altitude where no one in the organization had the standing to question her judgment. Her attorneys handled legal matters, not operational security. Her regional managers never interacted with Darius directly. She was the only person who saw the full picture, and the full picture, as she understood it, included a trusted friend named Roberto who happened to be very good with money. The fatal flaw wasn't greed. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't addiction. It was loneliness, the specific corrosive loneliness of being the only person in a brutal world who could quote the Sorbonne curriculum and calculate offshore wire fees in the same conversation. She never considered the possibility that the most dangerous person in her life would be the quietest, the most polite, and the most genuinely kind. And every day Darius filled that void. The microphone in his pocket recorded another piece of evidence that would end her career, her freedom, and everything she had built. The operation that brought her down was called Swordfish, and on paper it was a masterpiece of federal strategy. The DEA had created Dean International Investments, a fully functional fake investment firm in Miami Lakes, designed to offer exactly the laundering services that the cartels desperately needed. The theory was elegant. Instead of chasing drug money through the banking system after it disappeared, build the bank yourself and let the money walk through the front door. In practice, the operation was a bureaucratic disaster held together almost entirely by one man, the same man who was holding the Navarro's trust. Behind the polished facade of Dean International, the DEA agents running Swordfish were tearing themselves apart. Agent Frank Cellino, who posed as the firm's president, Frank Dean, began absorbing his character's arrogance, dismissive of colleagues, treating the operation as his personal stage. Tom Clifford, the agent technically in charge, resented Cellino's posturing and fought back at every turn. The two men clashed constantly. Critical wiretap recordings were lost through carelessness. Seized cartel cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars, sat unguarded in office closets because no one had established a proper evidence protocol. At one point, an anonymous tip suggested Dean International's cover had been blown, and Clifford moved to shut the entire operation down. Cellino argued it was a bluff. The team nearly fractured, and beneath all of it, the DEA discovered that the IRS and U.S. Customs were running a parallel sting, Operation Greenback, targeting some of the same individuals. Federal agencies were literally tripping over each other in the rush to take credit for dismantling the same networks. Through all of this chaos, Darius kept showing up. He kept recording. He kept Navarro engaged, maintained her trust, and ensured that the evidence pipeline never stopped flowing. The DEA had built the trap, but Darius was the one who kept it operational, unpaid, unprotected, and increasingly aware that the agency he served was more dysfunctional than the cartel he was infiltrating. The recordings accumulated over 18 months, from April 1981 through late 1982. Over 300 conversations, Navarro discussing shipments she referred to as shares and spare parts, Navarro detailing commission structures, delivery schedules, wire transfer destinations, and on the wiretapped home phone lines, Alvarez himself, his voice captured from Bogota, casually approving transactions worth millions. The recordings were so clear that when Alvarez later faced a witness stand, he was forced to admit the voice was his. When the indictments finally came down, they swept up 30 members of the Alvarez organization in a single coordinated action. But the ending wasn't clean. The operation was forced into a premature conclusion when a corrupt source inside law enforcement leaked details of the investigation to its targets. Simultaneously, Navarro's attorney discovered through his own legal channels that her phones were tapped and a federal grand jury was preparing charges. The moment she understood what had happened, the moment she realized that the gentlemanly Cuban she'd confided in for 18 months had been recording every word, she dropped every layer of the persona she had spent decades constructing. She made a direct threat against Roberto Darius's family, the woman who had built her entire identity on being above the violence, on being the civilized architect in a savage trade, reached for the same weapon that every cartel enforcer reaches for when cornered. Contemporary observers would describe her as dangerous as TNT. It was the most revealing moment of her entire story, not because it showed who she had become, but because it showed who she had always been underneath the locked suitcases and the negotiated commission rates. Then, she ran. Using her international connections, her multiple identities, and her remaining liquid assets, she fled the United States and disappeared into Venezuela. The escape was dramatic, but it was also temporary. The weight of 300 recorded conversations doesn't diminish with distance. A coordinated international effort tracked Navarro across borders until Venezuelan authorities located and detained her. Her return to Miami was legally contested. Investigative reporters noted that the extradition was likely conducted outside proper legal channels, a reflection of the aggressive, rules-optional approach that defined the war on drugs at its most zealous. Either way, she was back, in the same city where she had once moved millions without anyone knowing her name. The trial that followed became the longest federal criminal proceeding in the history of the Southern District of Florida. The prosecution's case was built on something Navarro herself had constructed, a meticulous, detailed, and utterly damning record of her own words. delivered voluntarily to a man she considered her closest friend. The jury heard the tapes. They heard her discuss the $80 million annual operation. They heard her coordinate the ransom logistics. They heard Alvarez's voice on her home phone, approving wire transfers from Bogota. The defense had no effective counter to audio evidence this comprehensive. Navarro was convicted on charges including narcotics conspiracy, violations of the Travel Act, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The sentence was 32 years in federal prison. Carlos Jader Alvarez, the godfather she had served so faithfully, the man whose children she had helped rescue, was extradited from Colombia and faced his own federal reckoning. The financial architecture Navarro had spent years building was seized, frozen, and dismantled. The entire North American wing of the Alvarez organization ceased to exist. Even in its aftermath, the case refused to resolve cleanly. In February 1993, years into her sentence, Navarro's defense team discovered that the official court transcription of her marathon trial had been severely botched. They argued successfully that without an accurate record, her appellate rights were compromised. A federal judge, the same William Hovler, who would later preside over the Manuel Noriega trial, agreed and ordered a new trial within 90 days. The government scrambled to locate retired DEA agents and scattered witnesses, spending enormous sums to reassemble a case they had already won. The original evidence held. The tapes were the tapes. And then there was the journalist, David McClintock, the investigative reporter who would write the definitive account of Operation Swordfish, visited Navarro almost daily while she sat in a Miami jail cell awaiting trial. She spoke with him extensively. The same pattern, the same vulnerability. A brilliant, isolated woman, desperate for someone who could engage her mind, opening up completely to a man who listened intently and took careful notes. She had been undone by one confidant secretly gathering material for the government. Now she was confiding in another secretly gathering material for a book. The cruelest fate, though, belonged to the man who made it all possible. Roberto Darius had risked his life every day for 18 months. He had maintained his cover under conditions that would have broken most trained agents. He had single-handedly kept a dysfunctional federal operation alive through sheer competence and composure. His recordings had produced 30 federal indictments in the extradition of a major cartel leader. His reward was 2 years of bureaucratic warfare. The DEA refused to pay his promised $100,000 bonus. The IRS refused to negotiate his debt. When the agencies finally settled, only after the federal prosecutor personally intervened, Darius received approximately $73,000. The IRS immediately seized the check to cover his outstanding tax debt. The man who had dismantled an $80 million a year laundering operation walked away with nothing. No money, no protection, no acknowledgement. Just a lifetime of looking over his shoulder for cartel associates who knew exactly what he had done. Intelligence without self-awareness is just a more sophisticated form of blindness. Navarro could read a banking regulation, a foreign jurisdiction, a commission structure. She could move through 5 languages and 3 continents without missing a step, but she could not read her own loneliness. And in the end, that was the only vulnerability that mattered. The DEA didn't catch the Hummingbird with surveillance technology or forensic accounting. They caught her with empathy. And the fact that Darius's empathy was genuine, that he actually liked her, actually found her fascinating, made the trap inescapable. You can't detect a lie when the person telling it believes most of it themselves. The federal government spent millions of dollars building a fake bank to catch Marlene Navarro. They deployed teams of agents, secured wiretap warrants, and ran an 18-month undercover operation that nearly fell apart from internal dysfunction half a dozen times. And in the end, the thing that actually brought her down cost nothing at all. It was a man who listened. What do you think was more dangerous in 1980s Miami? The people moving the cocaine or the people moving the money? Drop your answer in the comments. If this is your first time here, subscribe. There's more to come.